Welcome to the Riveo Impact Lab, the podcast in which we explore what it means for small businesses to have real impact in an evolving world. On this podcast, we engage our curiosity around topics like sustainability, diversity and inclusion, and the ethical outcomes of our decisions, all from a small business perspective.
You can find our podcast on audio platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or if you prefer to watch the video version, we're on YouTube, and you can also get to it from our website. I'm Elin.
And I'm Emily, and this week we're sharing our interview with Nancy Levine Stearns. Nancy is a journalist and the founder of the nonprofit project Impact. Her reporting has been cited by the New York Times, NBC News, and Forbes, among other publications. And she was the #1 ESG influencer on Twitter in 2020, according to a Cometric study. Nancy was a career executive recruiter, starting at American Express headquarters in New York City, and later recruiting for companies and nonprofits including Clorox, Wells Fargo, and Autodesk, among many others. And she is also the author of the Tao of Pug book. It's a 4-book series from Penguin and Skyhorse. And she attended New York University's Stern School of Business. Nancy is originally from Scarsdale, New York, and now resides with her husband, Michael, in Eugene, Oregon.
So I had the pleasure of talking with Nancy for this podcast, and I loved our conversation. I especially really enjoyed hearing about her experience reporting as a journalist on these large corporations and what goes on in the boardroom. What she was talking about was very encouraging because she was talking about these big corporations standing up to people who want to eliminate DEI programs or ESG programs. And the people that are standing up for these programs are right at the helm, right at the top of the leadership of some of the largest corporations in our country. I found that very encouraging.
Yeah, I think that is the kind of encouragement that we could all use right now, especially from a small business perspective. Hearing that it's happening at the corporate level is going to be really powerful. So please enjoy our conversation with Nancy Levine Stearns.
Okay. Nancy, I am really excited to talk to you today. And I want to start out just by asking you a little bit about your background. So you've worn a lot of hats. You're a journalist, executive recruiter, author. What are the threads of purpose or passion that connect all those roles for you?
That's a great question. So I started out in corporate America. I started a long time ago in human resources. The idea of the human side of business, sometimes referred to as human capital, which can be a little dehumanizing. But how do it's so important. I was in large corporations, so it's always important. I think in any size business, what role does the talent play? And it's because businesses are made up of people. So that's where I cut my teeth at American Express Company in their human resources department at their headquarters in New York City in the early 80s, actually, and grew into a recruiting role and then moved to California. I was mostly in the financial services sector. And then I joined a boutique executive search firm. And then I was working in California with still in the financial services sector, but also with some tech companies because they're so prevalent there. So that was very foundational, I'd say, for me. As far as purpose-driven, I'd say that was more in the foundation of what role do people play. And somewhere in there, you mentioned author. So I did author a series of. It was actually in the downturn. It was during the mortgage meltdown of 2008, I think it was. Anyhow, there was a meltdown. And I or it was a little before that, but I wrote some books about. I heard you had a dog barking in the background, and so I wrote some books about an enlightened pug dog. I had a pug dog, and I wrote a book called the Tao of Pug, and even in that, some of the purpose, the Tao refers to the Tao Te Ching. It's an ancient Chinese philosophical document. It was a playful book. It was the dog's interpretation of Chinese philosophy, but even that was purpose-filled because that document, the Tao Te Ching and Taoism, is about living in harmony with nature and conscience and instinct. What are our best instincts? About 10 years ago, I segued into journalism. I was writing about my career in corporate America had segued into recruiting for boards and C-level executives, and that intersects with corporate governance in large organizations. What are the either rules of corporate governance or best practices of corporate governance? And so I was writing about that, and it was a rather natural or organic kind of segue into crossing that bridge between best practices in corporations. There's a lot of reputation. I was looking at what is a company's reputation? How does it define itself? What are its values? And so that's what I was writing about. And then to be honest, I had planned to retire this year at the start of this year. And what happened, and this is how I think we came into this conversation, is you might have heard about Costco's decision to stick with its diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and that has been very well publicized. And so I wrote a story right at the beginning of January. Costco's board encouraged its shareholders to vote. It sounds like a double negative, but they encouraged them to vote to reject an anti-DEI proposal. So there are shareholder activists who come to the board and say, we think you shouldn't have whatever DEI policies you have. And the board said, we want to reject your proposal. And so I wrote about that. And one thing kind of led to another. I wrote for a platform called the Queen Zone, which elevates women's voices, which is important and certainly a part of the diversity landscape. And what I found in doing that research was that Costco is not the only company, not by a long shot, that sticks with its diversity and inclusion policies. And what I have found is that there are any number of boards that encouraged their shareholders, as Costco did, to vote to reject whatever the anti-DEI policy proposals were and stick with whatever policies they had in place, and they justified keeping their policies. So that's a very long-winded response to how we got to this point, how I got to this point.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I think we should do a part 2 podcast just on the whole like Tao of the pug thing, because I often think that dogs really are that, godliness that, or at least part of that in our lives.
Right. And that would be refreshing for me. And that's, that was my mindset at the time, was like, there is a certain purity of thought that gels nicely with that philosophy of just how do we live in concert with nature,
Living in the moment,
living in the moment, right?
always
And dogs
loving, always like
and
all the
dogs
things. Yeah,
really embody that. So
very joyful.
yeah,
Yeah.
joy.
But but this podcast is about something different. So, but the Costco example is a great one, and interesting that kind of launched you onto this journey. The DEI initiative, the DEI, the fact that they stuck with DEI has been good for their business. And I think some other companies are finding the same thing, or the opposite if they've chosen not to do that, as we've seen with somebody like Target.
Right. And apparently so. I think it's there's a correlation, or at least a coincidence that's happened at the same time. Now I don't think we could I haven't seen any studies that say there's something causative or causal, that because Costco stuck with their DEI, their sales increased, but the data is what it is. And so the foot traffic at Costco, where they stuck with their DEI, and there was quite a lot of pressure. So there was pressure from the shareholder group, and then reported, not quite as much after the vote took place, and shareholders voted 98 to 2% effectively to uphold the company's existing DEI policies. So there was this overwhelming shareholder vote, and within, I don't know, within a short time, I think it was 19 state attorneys general wrote a letter to Costco, saying, demanding really that Costco repeal, they used the word repeal, its DEI initiatives. And nothing much came of that. And then the state attorney general, who was one of the initiators of that, was from Iowa. And she subsequently, in April, she said, I had a productive meeting with Costco. But in fact, there's no announcement that anything has changed. And I think they just felt like they had standing and they were going to stick with their policies. So
Well, it's something a lot of people are paying attention to. So it's interesting that they're
Yeah.
taking that stance. And I wonder, like, are there trends you're seeing in how shareholders are voting on DEI and ESG issues in
Yes.
2025?
Yeah, I haven't tracked as closely the more broad ESG issues because there are climate initiatives, and just the DEI initiatives keep me fully in business, fully writing and reporting. Um, but what I can say, to your question about trends, is absolutely, and it's an overwhelming and unmistakable trend. There are, I counted up the companies, I think it's 27 of America's largest corporations have voted essentially uniformly. Shareholders have voted essentially uniformly, urged unanimously by their boards of directors to reject anti-DEI proposals starting in January, I guess this was. So in
Hmm.
25. So it's an overwhelming trend. It's an unequivocal trend. There are no examples of even close votes. These are all the votes are, in some cases, we count the shareholder voting, we round to whole numbers. So it's been 99 to 1%, 98 to 2%, right in the somewhere between the support has been typically between 97 to 100%, really, rounding to whole numbers. It's funny you mentioned Target. Target was a little bit of an outlier. Even then, it was 90. I just looked at this number. I think it was 92% of Target shareholders, same thing, voted to reject. So it's really a uniform kind of vote. Now, to be sort of fair, it's very common for boards of directors to typically advise their shareholders to vote to reject outside proposals. That is common. But what I noticed so I've attended most of these meetings, shareholder meetings. And what I notice is that even if the shareholders, even if they are voting to reject other proposals about, bottling or whatever the other proposals are, these proportions are noticeably huge. So sometimes, like I've seen other proposals get maybe 20% or 30%. So it's a little more balanced. So I'm in the midst of writing a new piece. I'm speaking to several experts, and I'm going to try to get a beat on why the hugeness of the tally. I mean, I have, I'm not an opinion writer, so I'm not going to venture an opinion. I'm more reporting facts. But the trend is unmistakable. It's huge. It's unequivocal. And a few CEOs at some of the corporations where shareholders have voted have voiced support. I think now this is speculation, but it's possible they have been emboldened by each other. And so most noticeably to me at the Merck annual meeting. Merck is a giant pharmaceutical company. It's like a
Merck
200
has
billion.
a strong belief, I think, in their own DEI and
That's
ESG
for sure.
policies.
Yeah. And what was most noticeable of all these meetings, and when I say all, it's like Costco, Apple, it's the largest corporations in America, American Express, the list goes on and on. But what was most notable was they have some corporations have Q&A sessions in the shareholder meetings. And they fielded, the CEO of Merck fielded a question from a shareholder asking about their DEI policies. And he gave a very bold, unequivocal, fairly lengthy statement, but the message was diversity and inclusion is a strategic imperative. And that was his language. It's a strategic
Hmm.
imperative. And I can't speak really for the other companies, but there is similar language in some of the proxy statements where the boards advise how the shareholders should vote. And in some of the corporations, there's very similar language saying that it's a strategic imperative or we're making a decision. And so the language varies. Merck was noticeable in its directness. It was a very
Hmm.
noticeably
That's
direct
That's
and
really
bold.
interesting. And I have to say that this is my opinion, my experience as a small business owner. Many of the conversations I've been having with other small business owners, taking politics out of it, is really just diversity is generally good for business.
Yeah,
It's good
that's
for you to
right.
have a diverse
Right.
staff and team,
Yeah.
and it's good for you to have a diverse customer
Yeah.
base.
Right.
Um,
Right. And
take emotion
yeah.
out of it, and it's just good for business.
And I think that's what we're seeing, and that's the nature of the, certainly of the voting. I mean, if the voting is any indication, and if the board recommendations are any indication, that's what we're seeing. And we see different languaging in each corporation's proxy statement, but essentially they're all saying the same thing, and especially the companies that I'm looking at, they're not small businesses. These are large multinational corporations with, multinational employee base, multinational customers, a global marketplace, and it's not really that big of a leap that it's good for
Yeah,
business, and it's not
it just
illegal.
makes sense.
It is just it's
Yeah.
not some of the opposing forces in the proxy statement, they like to say illegal DEI. That is just not true. That is just and companies have, they have legal staffs, and they have made adjustments to ensure that their programs are legal, and there's plenty of documentation to that effect. In fact, the state attorney general from Illinois, Kwame Raoul, I think was his name, um, he wrote a fantastic piece for Proxy Preview, which I think is published by a group called As You Sow, which is a friend of ours. He wrote a long piece, and he was speaking on behalf of, I think it was 15 state attorneys general, saying DEI is not illegal. Stick by your gun. Make sure you're running a legal program. And every large corporation is. They've really come through it. So there's nothing illegal about it. It's really, I think I mean, I'm not an attorney, so I can't. I'm not going to say what's legal or not legal. But there's quite a lot of documentation showing that a program that is well run is not illegal. And that is a bit of a mischaracterization and a misdirect from everything I've read.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that from what I've experienced and observed, it is, maybe it might get you in the room, but if you're not qualified, it's not going to get you the job. If you don't have good pricing, it's not going to get you the
Yeah,
job. You still have to
right.
compete on
Oh,
those other
absolutely.
issues.
And all it does is it expands the talent pool. So I came from
Yeah.
corporate recruiting and corporate human resources, and the imperative, the part about the strategic and business imperative is that these environments are enormously competitive, and in order to compete successfully, we have to have access to the widest possible pool of talent so that nobody is excluded due to implicit or explicit biases. And that's all we're talking about, is evening the playing field, really, so that we can make the best hires, so that we can consider the best talent and the best hires. And I don't think there's really much argument against that. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I moved to a small town where I didn't grow up. And when I was focusing on doing business here, and I'm a small business, I'm not a large corporation, but it was really hard to get into the room because I wasn't in the old boys club. And I think that's just like large scale what corporations are trying to do with DEI, like that. There's been a lot of misinformation, like you said, about it, and people don't understand what it is. But
yeah, there has been some misinformation, I'd say, about just discrimination.
yeah,
I mean, unfortunately, Stephen Miller's group, Stephen Miller is a White House advisor, and he, prior to being in his current role, he founded a nonprofit. It's called America First Legal, and he came up with a list of what he called woke corporations, and it was some of these same corporations that we're looking at the top of their list now. He has Apple, and or his group, I should say the group he founded, sent a letter to Apple in advance of its shareholder meeting. I think it was in February, suggesting that their DEI initiatives were illegal. Apple, I'm sure, has access to the finest lawyers probably on the planet. And same thing, Apple board suggests, suggested, recommended that Apple shareholders vote to reject the anti-DEI proposal. They did so. I don't have the percentage right in front of me, but it was either 98 to 2 or 98 to 98 to 2 or 99 to 1%. And interestingly, I just noticed this today, actually, after that point, after, this on this woke corporations list, that was the last of they wrote a letter to Apple saying, you better not do this. And then Apple was like, this is our business. We're running it. And then that was the last corporation list, but it's called woke corporation. So there's this, there are vectors, I'd say, of forces: government, conservative shareholder activists, There's social media influencers. You might have heard of. I don't know if you've heard of this guy, Robbie Starbuck. So he is he's a social media influencer. He approached. I think it was starting last summer. He approached several large corporations, and using his language, he threatened to expose them for their so-called woke policies. And some companies did. I think they got nervous. Probably this was a year ago, and they did some rolling back, or either tweaking of or rolling back of their DEI programs. They did not scrap them. They did not ditch them. They did not abandon them. There's a perception, I think, propagated probably by some of these conservative sources and some, maybe mainstream media. However this happened, there is I think, a narrative, that companies have scrapped DEI, and that's kind of how I got involved. Because when I scratched the surface, I thought, well, that is not exactly accurate. That is not entire. There are there's really a handful of companies that maybe have scrapped. I think Meta probably comes to mind, and even that I haven't looked really closely, but it's they're probably closer to certainly scrapping, I'd say. But really, most other companies have some commitment to diversity and inclusion. Companies of this size have commitments to diversity and inclusion because it's good for business. It's good for the bottom line. Look, nobody's more devoted to the bottom line than large corporations and their
Yes.
investors. And so it's just a business decision. Honestly, I spent a lot of time in and around corporations. And if this were, I could tell you what here's where I will express my opinion. If this were not good for the bottom line, they would not do it. The
Yeah,
large
totally
companies are
agree.
profit driven. Their largest investors are the largest asset managers in the world. They are profit driven. That's how it goes. And so that all these companies, really, and that was what the Merck CEO said as well. He mentioned profits, and some other companies have. Robert Reich, the economist from UC Berkeley, he just wrote a piece about the same, just corroborating that the large asset managers that own the most shares of these corporations just see it as enhancing their profitability. So, it's pretty straightforward. They're not discriminating. That's the accusation. There's plenty of evidence showing that they are not discriminating. But I think that will probably continue to be the argument around discrimination.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the case, but I think they will try to argue that. And they have the best lawyers in the world, and I think
Yeah,
they're.
I don't know. Well, I wonder, so you spend a lot of time observing these large corporations and reporting on the shareholder meetings and such. From what you've learned and observed, are there any lessons or, anything, any principles, lessons, anything that you could share that might be applicable to small business, that small
Yeah,
business can learn from these large
yeah.
corporations?
I mean, I think, I'm not on the inside of either of the corporations at this point, and certainly
Hmm.
not the small businesses. But I think the principles, and you might know better than I, are kind of the same. There's a lot written. The companies themselves write about they want to certainly have access to the best talent. For instance, choose from the best
Hmm.
talent. That's going to be true. To not have conscious or unconscious biases in making choices. So, as a hiring strategy, obviously that makes sense. And then as a business strategy, we live in a diverse world. We just live in a multicultural, diverse world. And so I think from both an employee standpoint and also a customer facing standpoint, whether that is the consumer or whether that is other businesses, we're in a multicultural world. And so I think for a business of any size, I think the same principles hold true. That you just want to have the access to the widest pool of talent in order to hire the best talent. Everybody who doesn't want to hire the best talent, of course, that makes sense. That's how a business thrives, right? So it makes sense from hiring, and then it makes sense, I think, in terms of appealing to whoever the customer or client is. I think the principles apply across. I think it might be size agnostic.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. Diverse world and one that is much more interesting than if we were totally monochromatic world. Like that would
Right.
be boring.
Yeah,
Like,
that is true,
yeah.
and that's the argument. So Stephen Miller's group says that part out loud. It's about in his some of those complaints. He says discriminating against. I think he says against white men. I think that is sometimes the argument. So
Oh, my violin,
yeah, right.
yeah,
So it's
poor white
not
men.
it's not holding up that well. The argument so far is, not holding up very well, let's say, at the board and shareholder level, in
Yeah,
corporate America.
that's
I
kind
can
of,
say
it's kind of encouraging to me. Let me change gears a little tiny bit, because I am curious about this. So, as someone reporting on publicly traded companies, what you do, how do you view the role of journalism in influencing corporate behavior, especially around issues like equity and accountability? Do you think there's a correlation?
it's a good question because I worked more on the accountability side prior to doing this project. We started a project. It's called Impact Devise. That's who I'm writing for, and we are focused specifically on DEI in the private sector. So we have a list of 400 corporations that are committed, and the shareholder voting results. But prior to this, so starting until last year, the end of last year, I was writing with a lens on corporate accountability. So I was still looking at reputational risk. So I'll just give you an example. I was focused somewhat on after Elon Musk bought Twitter, there was a proliferation. I didn't make it up. There was a lot of reporting about hate speech, the growth of hate speech on Twitter, and what I would find. Now, Elon didn't like this too much. So what I found was there were some advertisers and Twitter did try to fix this, and I think maybe they did. But at first, initially, before they had thoroughly fixed it, there were some ads that were appearing adjacent to hate speech. And so the accountability piece for me was I would reach out to corporations and say, and I would just take a screenshot. It would just be, are you aware? What do you make of this? And so in one instance, now this was either 22 or 23. I think it was 23, 2023. Um, the large car company Hyundai. I just, I didn't have to really search at that point. Hyundai's ad appeared next to some um, really distasteful, hateful content. I don't even need to say what it was. And all I did was I took a screenshot. I said, "Have you seen this?" And they said they're going to pause their advertising program. So I think that is an example of the accountability piece. I mean, it's really refreshing for me to actually be like not on a boycott side. I was a little bit on. I was more writing more on the sort of boycott side of the house. Right now, our work is more aligned with the work I really like the best is from the NAACP, which issued in February something called the Black Consumer Advisory. And it was more, it wasn't so much, at least my interpretation, it wasn't so much about boycotting, but it was here we have $1.7 trillion a year of spending power. Let's spend in the right places. And that's really the intent more of our of Impact Devise. Who's doing where do we want to spend our dollar for people who do support diversity, equity, and inclusion and think that's a good thing? Consumers do say, people ask me, they go, "Do you have a list?" And that's really how this was born. I said, "Here's Costco, here's Apple," and they go, "Well, do you have a list?" And so then we just started putting together a list. So it's sort of the plus side of accountability, which is very refreshing for me as a journalist. You asked how it is as a journalist. It is way more refreshing than sort of this gotcha. There could be a real darkness. It can be in I mean, accountability is fantastic, and I did it for a long time, so it is important and good work. But as a journalist, it's also very refreshing. Also, I get a lot of messages. I think you said it's hopeful. I get a lot of messages where people say, "Wow, this gives me some hope," and I don't think it's a false hope. I think if people are looking for glimmers of hope because how do we vote? Well, we vote in elections. We vote with our pocketbooks. And so people could say, well, here's how I can vote with my dollars. And that's why I also really liked the NAACP Black Consumer Advisory as well.
So I was going to ask you about hope. I was going to ask you, like, what is giving you hope as you watch corporate social responsibility and DEI landscape and watch it evolving in 2025? Do you feel that there is a broader awareness or more momentum, or is there some kind of movement in a positive direction here?
Yeah, I think because of the gravity and unanimity of this, especially the shareholder voting and the board recommendations of shareholder voting, I think that creates a gravity, a sort of a strength in numbers. You might see behind me, I have my favorite basketball team is the Golden State Warriors, and they had for many years their motto was strength in numbers. And I think consumers feel that. I think that engenders hope in the consumer population. And then whether corporations are emboldened. Now we've seen kind of a run of the table of these shareholder meetings and of boards. Are they emboldened? I'm not in the boards. It appears that way. It appears that there certainly could be a strength in numbers. I think certainly um, among feedback that I get from consumers, it's like this is where I'm going to shop, and we do see it in the it's a very um, a small sample group, but we do see that result in the Costco, Target,
Mhm.
different results on foot
A
traffic.
lot of people were talking about that and are
Yeah.
still talking about that.
Yep. Yeah, and so even though
Yeah.
it's a small sample group, it's also they're huge corporations, and people are paying attention to that. And I see it. I see feedback. So just in the last few weeks, some other big retailers where shareholders have voted to uphold the company's DEI or reject anti-DEI proposals would be Best Buy,
Mhm.
Dick's Sporting Goods, a large retailer. I think they're back east also. Um,
They were
and
founded in my town here where I live,
oh, I did not know.
Binghamton, New York.
Really? Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't I'm from New
yeah,
York, I did not know that, that's interesting.
yep.
Okay. So,
Not many things came out of Binghamton, but that was one of them.
that's a great
Yeah.
thing for me to learn, I did not know that. So I just see, anecdotally, I see feedback of people saying that's where we're gonna shop, and certainly, it's very much in alignment with the NAACP's Black Consumer Advisory and the $1.7 trillion spend and beyond, because it's not, I
Mhm.
think targeting the Black consumer spend, but there's a vast universe of allyship, where there's a lot of dollars to be spent. So I think we're going to see that. I think it gives people hope, and I think there may be some gravity and strength in numbers from the collective group. And it's in the trillion. The market cap of the worth of these companies is in the probably the tens of trillions of dollars. That's a lot of gravity. That is a lot of
Mhm.
gravity.
Mhm.
It remains to be seen, I think, how this will all play out. But they're not companies are not there. There might be some renaming. You maybe have heard or read about companies are renaming, and Harvard Law School. I think it was the Harvard Law School. They have a corporate governance institute, and they just came out with a study on renaming, and they came up with all the different names. There's like belonging and culture and inclusion, and there's a
Mhm.
lot of different naming. What we say at Impact Advise, we say DEI or by any other name, because
Right.
what matters to the practitioners who I talk to, what matters is the intention and the weave of the practices into the business, and you can call that, I think, and some companies do still call it DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mhm.
It's code, but my understanding is that what matters is the practice itself, and that does not appear to be going away because it's good for business.
Yeah, I mean, that's really encouraging. And it's interesting to think about the collective power of people like so voting with their pocketbooks, and deciding which companies to back. That
Yeah,
that I think that right now it feels like things are very serious and we have to pay attention. And I think a lot of people are feeling like that. So
right.
I would hope that this does, begin to build momentum and continue to go in the right direction.
I think it will. Probably one thing I should add is that we look at DEI or by any other name in a through a very narrow lens. So
Hmm.
'cause I get some feedback about companies' other practices. So if I report on, we'll just take Merck since it's a good example. There's criticisms of every large company, and I don't even know what the criticisms of that company are. We're not looking at a company's goodness. We're not looking at their political donations, and we're not looking at their affiliations. We are looking at their diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. And the reason why we're looking through a narrow lens is because the targeting is looking also at them, is attacking them
Hmm.
real through that same narrow lens. And so it's a way to report, I think, most accurately on what is actually happening through that
Hmm.
lens in that
Yeah,
in that
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, fun question. Looking ahead, what are you most excited to explore in your journalism or professional work?
Ah, okay. Well, it's very immediate. So I'm working on a story that is essentially a summary. I've attended most of all of, I think it's been a few of these meetings I was locked out. It wasn't open to journalists, but I've attended probably in the neighborhood of 20 shareholder meetings. And I'm writing up a summary essentially of the findings of my observations from these meetings with the backdrop of other reporting and other studies and that will also be published by, I mentioned the publication that I like to write for is called The Queen Zone. And that will be published probably within the next week. And so I'm excited about that, mostly because I started it, I was making notes, but I actually started writing it today. So as probably a lot of writers maybe can relate, you just have to like start. Sometimes starting it is, really gets you going. But I have a great
Good for
body of information.
you. Good for you. A lot of times I'm like composing something in my mind for a long time before I ever actually write it down.
Which is good, which is good. So, yeah, so I
Good or
finally
procrastination, I'm not sure.
well, I think that's
It's a
part of the
process.
writing craft. I think I
Yeah.
mentioned to a journalist friend of mine that I was like, I have all the notes. I'm ready to start. I just need to start. And she said, "You sound like every journalist." And she wrote for a daily newspaper back east, and she said, "You sound like every journalist that she
Mhm.
knows." It's not uncommon,
Mhm.
but anyway, so very excited about that. That should drop. The kids say drop. That should drop probably within the next week. So
Oh,
I'm
wonderful. I
excited.
can't wait to see it.
Yeah,
I
thank
can't wait
you.
to see it. Great. Are you gonna be sharing that on social media, or where will we find that?
Yes, I will be sharing it on social media. The Queen Zone will be sharing it on social media. We'll spread it as far and wide as we
Fabulous.
can because we think it tells a story. What I think is that the story of corporations that are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there are many of them, tells a different story than the narrative that I walked into in January, which is, I still see it. There's still a misperception, a general public misperception. People will write to me and they go, "Oh, wait, I thought companies abandoned DEI." It's like, well, not exactly. That's how this started. I was like, because I found that out myself because I was like, "Oh, I thought companies abandoned DEI." And then I
Mhm.
just, it's like pulling socks out of a drawer where they're all connected. It's like, well, not exactly. And so, that's the story I think the data tells. It's like
Mhm.
DEI, it's not dead in the private sector. So
Yeah, I think there's intentional misinformation around a lot of this stuff personally, but that's
probably
just
that.
speculation. But
Right,
but maybe not.
that could well be. I can't say what's intentional or not, but I think
Yeah.
there is. I think there's been some mischaracterization and we're just attempting to be a little more granular and a little more robust in our reporting to tell a more complete, fuller, truer story.
Yeah, and truly we need you. We need journalists that are paying attention to the facts and reporting the facts because, without truth, we are lost. So thank you.
Right. Yeah,
We
thank
really
you.
need that.
Thank you.
So I know you work with big corporations or you write about big corporations as we've discussed. If you could distill down a message for small business owners who want to align values and action, what would that be based on what you've seen at the corporate level?
I would say to the extent possible, be courageous in your I've heard that from a few different places. Courage is contagious. There's a lot of fear mongering, I think. It's natural and easy to be cowed by fear. And the messaging that I kind of keep hearing over and over is, be strong, be courageous. Now, I get that that's hard. We're a nonprofit, so we're like a small business. So it's easy for me to say, I'm not being targeted yet, but as a small business, it's a balance, right? You have to stay in
Yeah.
business and thrive, but to the extent possible, be strong, be courageous. There's a lot of us and them, of people out there, people and
Yeah.
there who are staying strong, and I do believe there is strength in numbers, and so I think that's the message I hear is stay strong, be courageous. There's nothing illegal about considering wide talent pools, and it's
Right.
probably best for hiring the best talent. And
Right.
and
Yeah.
well, and also there's a mistaken message that diversity is opposed to merit. And
Right.
there was just a new study from MIT Sloan Management Review writing about how DEI enhances merit. I don't think, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the word was enhanced, but that's the message. And we hear that again and again. The co-founder of Reddit, uh, Alexis Ohanian, said he identified as the biggest sham out there is this notion that merit and diversity are opposed. And he said, those of us who have been out here building, and he started building small companies, right? He said, those of us who have been now Reddit probably turned into a multi-billion-dollar company. He said, have been hiring for merit all along. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, I have never heard of any, I'm only one person. I have a limited experience and, network. I have a pretty good network, but I have never heard of what they say is happening. I've never heard of that happening because you always have to prove your value and you always have to prove your competence and, all of that. So I don't know. It's fascinating.
It is. One of our advisory board members, her name is Sherry Dunn. She wrote a book called Qualified, and it's about
Hmm.
how people in the workplace constantly have to prove and reprove their competencies. And there's this competency checking that applies, it's a terrible double standard. So in fact, the talent level is probably, because of this checking and overachieving is probably way, way, way higher. So
Hmm.
there are a lot of really kind of false tropes, shall we say,
Hmm. Yeah, very
forming
much so.
I'd say, what appears to be a war. I think of it there's a war on diversity, equity, inclusion. It's really fueled by a lot of really false tropes that really don't support, that are not in alignment with business, what people in business know and experience.
So much to unpack. But what about, so this is my last question, and then I'll ask how we can get in touch with you and find you. We're very interested in impact here, and impact can be defined in many different ways. And I'm just curious what impact means to you.
Yeah, it can mean so many things. I mean, I'm so steeped for the last 6 months, I've been very steeped in this particular arena. So, the first thing that's gonna come to my mind is impact insofar as it, relates to diversity and equity and inclusion, hiring and workplace practices. But more broadly, how do we make I almost go back to the pug book, how do we make a difference, live in concert with nature, with conscience, with science. I will say I don't usually opine, but I do believe in science. Uh, and how do we and empathy? How do we? So this does go back to my pug book roots. How do we live with empathy? How do we believe in science? So there's some really basic kinds of impacts that we can make more broadly. I'd say use our voices. I'd say every voice matters. How do we speak out for what is right, for tolerance, for inclusiveness, for empathy? Impact is very broad. I've been on a very narrow track with it, but impact is certainly very broad, and really we could have impact every day. We could have an impact on somebody's life, who we pass on the street, and we don't know
Hmm.
what ripple we create. So
Hmm.
to live as best as we can in balance and peace and kindness and empathy.
Hmm.
That's the really broad view. So
I love the answer, and it all matters. Like
yeah,
sometimes people think that their actions are too small to matter, but it all matters.
it
So
all
thank you for
matters
sharing
always.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Ellen. I
Oh,
really appreciate your having me.
it was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, you please share with us how people can get in touch with you, follow you, get that list of the
Mhm.
companies that they might want
Yeah.
to spend their money with.
Yeah, so the best place to go is our website. It's called Impact Devise. It's like impact and then letter I, Devise,
Uh-huh.
impactdevise.org. Impactdevise.org. And that has a list of 400 companies and brands that state their commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it has a list of the shareholder voting from about 225 or more companies where they have supported. DEI initiatives. And that is probably the best. There's a contact button on there. You can follow me on social media, follow Impact Device. So that's the best way to
Okay.
find us. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll do that. So, Nancy,
Okay.
thank you so much for your time. This was a
Thank you,
really
Alex.
enlightening conversation,
Thanks.
and
Thank you.
you just bring such a rich perspective to the whole question of DEI and how and why and what just like to help us figure out what is going on. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Our Make an Impact tip of the week is support journalism. Subscribe to your local newspaper or donate to nonprofit news sources like NPR or PBS. Thanks for listening, and make sure to do good in the world this week. If you have questions you'd like us to address on the podcast, you can reach us at info@riveocreative.com. Subscribe wherever you listen so you don't miss out on any of our incredible upcoming guests, and we'll see you soon at the Riveo Impact Lab.